Hi guys, welcome back. This is a lesson B on the nervous system and its connection to exercise. And what we're looking at today is to explain the function of the muscle proprecipitators and the stretch reflex. So that doesn't make sense, we'll break it down and we'll look at that in a bit more detail. We'll be able to explain reciprocal inhibition. We'll be able to explain neuromuscular adaptations associated with exercise and training, and we'll be able to explain the benefits of improved neuromuscular coordination or efficiency to exercise performance. And the first thing that we want to look at is something called the muscle spindles. And really, all the muscles, pretty much all of them, they have two small neural sensors really that help provide feedback and respond to changes within the muscle itself. And the first one that we want to look at, as I said, is called the muscle spindle, and it's located deep inside the muscle, so right inside the muscle. What the spindle is really it's a small sort of sensor unit, and it wraps really tightly around individual muscle fibers, a bit like a coiled spring, like you can see some of the blue ones here. So it wraps around individual muscle fibers like a real tight coiled spring. And when muscles change length, what happens is the coils of the spindle, either they'll get pushed apart or they'll get pushed close together, depending on whether the muscle is lengthening or whether the muscle is shortening. And the change in muscular length results in a change in the muscle spindle, and then really from there, when the length of the spindle changes, what happens is the spindle will stimulate nerves or neurons that travel back to the central nervous system, and what will happen is the net result of a lengthened muscle and muscle spindle is a stimulus to contract the muscle. Alright, so if you imagine, okay, that the muscle's getting longer and longer and it's starting to get stretched, okay, the spindle's going to detect that because the coils are going to get further apart. It's then going to send a message to our central nervous system saying we need to contract this muscle, we need to squeeze it, it's getting too stretched and it's at the risk of maybe getting injured or ruptured, whatever it might be. So when the spindles get really stretched, they'll stimulate a neuron going back to the central nervous system saying, come on, we need to squeeze this muscle, we need to make it tighter, it's getting too long. And the degree of contraction that occurs will depend on the degree of change in the muscle length and the rate at which the changing length occurs. So if that spindle gets unravelled really quickly, it's going on, we're getting really long, okay? What will happen is it'll send a message saying we need to contract really hard, we need to really squeeze and stop this muscle from getting damaged. If the spindle is just sort of unwinding a bit more gradually, what will happen is it'll send a message saying, okay, we're unravelling a bit, we just need to squeeze a little bit just to make sure we're okay, but it's not going to be your absolute maximum contraction. And sort of as a general rule, the greater the range of motion and the faster the muscle lengthens, the stronger the contraction will be. And this process is what we call the stretch reflex that you might have remembered that I mentioned right at the top of the presentation. And there you go, it's a little bit more of a breakdown there. So you have muscle spindle, which is right there, deep inside the muscle, and then it's then firing its message, then this sensory nerve into the spinal cord and the central nervous system, and from there the motor neuron is coming back and saying, look, come on, we need to contract, we need to squeeze this muscle. So let's have a little bit of a look at a video. This will help you out a bit more.
This particular image is showing an example, a diagram of the stretch reflex. The first component here is the stretch receptor. This is called muscle spindle. It is a sensory receptor that detects stretching in the particular muscle. When the muscle is stretched, for example, when a reflex hammer, like you see here, taps the patellar ligament, it creates a stretching in the muscle that will stimulate the receptor, which will then create a nerve impulse along the sensory neuron. Now it does this in the typical way. Mechanically gated ion channels will open in response to the stretch, depolarizing the membrane, creating a gradient potential. If the stretch is strong enough and enough ion channels open, the gradient potential will reach threshold and voltage gated ion channel will open, resulting in an action potential or nerve impulse along the sensory neuron, as you see here. Sensory neuron will travel back up the femoral nerve, in this case, or whichever nerve innervates the muscle in question, and it is going to travel back to the spinal nerve, into the dorsal root ganglion, into the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, into the spinal cord via the dorsal horn of gray matter, which you see here. And then we'll travel along this path right here, where the synapse is immediately a motor neuron. That motor neuron will take an impulse and continue the impulse through the ventral horn of gray matter, which you see here, out the ventral root, out the mixed spinal nerve, and back along that motor neuron to the same muscle. And will stimulate to contract, which will counteract the stretching to protect the muscle from an overstretch. This reflex is monosynaptic, meaning that there is only one synapse to have the reflex control. It is ipsilateral, meaning that the motor impulse leads on the same side of the spinal cord. And it is not intersegmental, meaning that the motor neuron is also on the same segment of the spinal cord as the sensory neuron. Now, the dotted line you see here and the extra branch you see here is what's called the reciprocal innervation. While this reflex is going on, another impulse is branching off from the sensory neuron that is going to stimulate an interneuron in the integrating center. This is the integrating center of the reflex arc. This is the integrating center of the reciprocal innervation. This interneuron is inhibitory, which means that it will synapse with a motor neuron, inhibiting it from firing a nerve impulse. That's why it's a dashed line. There is no impulse traveling along this motor neuron. This motor neuron innervates the hamstring muscles, which are the antagonist of the quadriceps. If this motor neuron is inhibited, it will prevent the hamstring muscles from contracting. What that does, that makes it easier for the quadricep muscles to contract because the opposing muscle is forced to relax. Each reflex has a reciprocal innervation. The reciprocal innervation will typically do the opposite of the reflex in the antagonistic muscles, making it easier for the reflex to take place. That's the reciprocal innervation. Now this stretch reflex, keep in mind, this example is the quadriceps, but keep in mind this is going to happen in most skeletal muscles. So I can use this example for the biceps brachii, where the reciprocal innervation would be the triceps brachii, or I could do it in the triceps brachii, where the reciprocal innervation would be the biceps brachii. So all of these muscles, these skeletal muscles, are going to have this stretch reflex to make sure that it is protected from overstretching.
Okay, so hope that helped. It did go, was a little
In this
bit...
video, I'm going to talk about the muscle stretch reflex. The nervous system performs many reflexes, and a reflex is a response to a stimulus that doesn't require the involvement of consciousness. All reflexes have two parts. The first part is called the afferent part, afferent, and that involves bringing information about a
Stop that because we don't need that. Come back into here. We'll make it full screen. Okay, so the video that we looked at just, okay, it did go, it was a little bit sort of, maybe it pushed your understanding more than sort of what I was talking about, which is fine because we're going to go on and we're going to look at some of those elements a bit later in this presentation. So if you're sort of thinking, oh, I don't really know what that reciprocal stuff was or what's all that about, you know, don't worry about it yet because I'm going to talk you through it and sort of get your understanding to the level that it needs to be. You know, I just thought I'd show that video so you could see the process a little bit more in the interaction between the muscles and the spindles and the spinal cord. But what I want to concentrate on now is the second pro-precipitator, and what this is called a Golgi or Golgi tendon, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And essentially, what this is, the Golgi tendon is it's inelastic, so that it's inelastic, and so the Golgi tendon can't detect changes in muscle length because it's not stretchy. However, when a muscle contracts, as we know, it pulls on a tendon, and the Golgi tendon is attached or is part of the tendon, and that's how it measures what's going on. So to break it down a little bit more, the Golgi tendon, it's ideally located to measure the amount of tension created by a muscle, and the GTO, when activated, sends a signal to the spine which brings about an inhibitory effect of the same muscle. Okay, so it's, you know, it measures the tension on that muscle, and when it's stimulated, it sends a message to the central nervous system saying, we're getting a bit too stretched. Come on, there's too much tension on this muscle. We need to relax. And the relaxation response brought about by the Golgi tendon firing is called an inverse stretch reflex. So the muscle spindles that we looked at earlier, they'll be continually activated sort of during really just human movement, you know, walking around, sitting down, standing up, as well as when you're in the gym and when you're training or running, whatever it may be. They'll be stimulated pretty much all the time, as the muscles will be changing lengths in conjunction with the movements that are being carried out. And this provides a constant stream of information to the central nervous system about the length of the muscles and where body parts are. The spindles also bring about muscular contraction that assists with the movements that are being performed, as we already know, whereas the Golgi tendon responds just after muscular contraction, not at the same time as it's happening. It's just after the contraction is engaged, by, as we said, inhibiting the muscular contraction to allow an action to be performed. So therefore, what we can say is that spindles and the Golgi tendon, they're like on and off switches for muscles, and it's sort of valuable to note that when a muscle is causing its primary actions to occur, then we already know that the opposite muscle needs to relax. So the spindles, they might be switching one muscle on, saying, come on, we need to contract. And then the Golgi tendon will be switching it off, the opposite muscle, saying, oh, we're getting a bit too stretched, we need to relax. All right, so if I was to talk you through it a little bit more, if you imagine your bicep is being squeezed, okay, the proprioceptor doing that would be your muscle spindles, okay? And then at the same time as the biceps getting squeezed and getting shorter and contracting, the opposite's happening in the tricep. So the Golgi tendon is sending a signal saying, come on, we need to relax, we need to get a little bit longer. So they're like on and off switches, and hopefully this will break it down a little bit more for you.
Okay, next we're going to talk about the tendon reflex. The tendon reflex is kind of the opposite of the stretch reflex in the effect that instead of responding to an excessive stretching of the muscle, This reflex responds to excessive contraction of the muscle, and instead of resulting in a contraction, it results in a relaxation. So this is an inhibitory reflex. The example that I have here for you is the quadricep muscle again, and this time the main part of the reflex is the dotted line because it's an inhibitory reflex. So this dotted line is the motor neuron of the tendon reflex. This reflex is polysynaptic, and it is also ipsilateral, much like the stretch reflex, which is also ipsilateral because it's affecting the same muscle that was stimulated. So let's start with the sensory. The blue neuron here is the sensory neuron, and we can see that in the musculotendinous junction of the quadricep muscle, we have all of these sensory receptors. In the tendon reflex, the sensory receptor is called a tendon organ, and it is stimulated by excessive, quick contraction of a muscle. When the muscle contracts quickly and excessively, it'll stimulate these sensory receptors, which will generate a graded potential and then ultimately an action potential along the sensory neuron. It's going to follow a typical reflex arc. There'll be a sensory receptor, a sensory neuron, an integrating center, a motor neuron, and an effector. All of the typical 5 components of a reflex arc. So we followed the sensory impulse back to the mixed spinal nerve, in through the dorsal root ganglion, because all sensory impulses travel through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, in the dorsal root, into the dorsal horn of gray matter, and then the main reflex arc will come on this branch here and synapse with an interneuron. Now, because it has to synapse with an interneuron, it is polysynaptic because it's going to require more than one synapse to complete the reflex arc. So here is the first synapse. This is a synapse between the sensory neuron and an inhibitory interneuron. This interneuron will have an impulse generated that comes to a synapse with the motor neuron for the same muscle. This synapse results in an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential on the motor neuron. What that means is that it has resulted in a hyperpolarization of the motor neuron's membrane potential. That brings the motor neuron further from threshold, meaning it's further from an action potential, making it much more difficult to stimulate an action potential or a nerve impulse in the motor neuron. That ultimately results in a relaxation of the quadricep muscles. There is no nerve impulse generated on the motor neuron in this reflex. You do not use nerve impulses to tell a muscle to not contract. Nerve impulses will only stimulate a muscle to contract. Therefore, the only way to get this muscle to relax, which is the ultimate goal of the reflex arc, is to inhibit a nerve impulse. And we do that by releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters at this synapse right here that creates an inhibitory postsynaptic potential in the motor neuron. Ultimately, their goal is a relaxation of the quadricep muscle, which is the opposite of the original stimulus, which was an excessive contraction of the quadricep muscle, which can be damaging, which is why this reflex is necessary. Now, while this is going on, there is, of course, reciprocal innervation. So a branch also comes out of the sensory neuron that stimulates an interneuron that will then synapse with the motor neuron for the antagonist muscle. Now, in the tendon reflex, we had said that if the muscle contracts, an antagonistic muscle should relax to make it easier to achieve that goal. Well, the opposite is true again. The reciprocal innervation causes the antagonist muscle in this case, which is the hamstring muscles here. It causes a contraction of those by stimulating a nerve impulse along the motor neuron that goes to the antagonist muscle, which is the hamstring muscles here. So one way to help to relax or stretch the quadricep muscle is to contract the opposite muscle, which is the hamstrings. That is the tendon reflex.
Okay, so just to follow up on that video a little bit more, and again, it was quite a scientific one, so I'll try and break it down into the things that really you need to take away from there. So, we have something called nervous inhibition, and really what we're trying to say is that the sort of inhibition is essentially it's all to do with the opposing muscles. So again, if we looked at biceps and triceps, if we looked at quads and hamstrings, they are muscles that work as a pair. And this inhibition of opposing muscles is called reciprocal inhibition, or RI, for example. And RI is a necessary part of movement, but it can also play a part in creating muscular imbalance. So if you imagine if you had a very tight muscle, so if you had very tight hamstrings, for example, which is quite common because people don't tend to train hamstrings quite as much as they should, all right? If you had a very, very tight hamstring, it will continuously send an RI signal to the opposing muscle. Because the hamstrings are always tight, they're going to keep telling the quads to relax. Come on, relax. We need some help. Relax, relax, relax. Help us out, help us out, help us out. Okay, and exercise and training has been shown to increase the neural side of the muscular response with improvements in the stretch reflex and the net response from an inverse stretch reflex. So again, to break that down a bit more, what we're trying to say is things like plyometrics, stretching routines, sort of even light sort of cardio type work can help in stretching out those hamstrings and reducing that continuous signal saying, come on, help us out, help us out, help us out. You can get those muscles to relax a bit more, then that's what we need to do as PTs, okay? I know this has been a bit of a scientific presentation, but essentially all we're trying to look at and all we're trying to take away, we'll look at that in a second, is that we've got the spindles that are working like the springs and they're looking at the length of the muscle and they tell us when to contract. We then have the Golgi tendon, or to give it its proper name, the GTO reflex, alright? And what that happens is when the muscles are getting long and really, really stretched, it sends a signal for us to relax, okay? And then we have reciprocal inhibition, which essentially is the process of those two muscles working together. So when the agonist contracts, for example, the bicep in a bicep curl, that's the agonist, all right? The tricep needs to relax, and it's the GTR reflex and the muscle spindles that help us to do that. Let's have a look at the adaptations to strength training, okay? So, what you can see here on the graph is that we have neural adaptation, hypertrophy, and strength, okay? And what we're looking at is neural adaptations, okay? Oh, I'm going to go back one. So essentially what you can see is if you start doing strength training, then you will have a big rise at the start of your training in terms of how well the nerves function, all right? And they'll start to learn very, very quickly and switch on more readily and more easily than they would do in the past. In particular with strength training, look how quickly that dotted light blue line's going up. Same thing with hypertrophy. If we're doing hypertrophy training, so if we're doing maybe 10, 12 reps on our exercises, we're looking at using a hypertrophy model or trying to gain more muscle mass, we're going to start improving, and we are going to make some big improvements, but not quite as much as strength training, okay? And that's the big thing to take away. When we first start training, our our nervous system is very, very quick to respond, okay? You get responses from the nervous system much more quickly than you'll begin to see muscles get bigger or gain strength. And that's the reason why when people first start training in their first sort of 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, you can get some big results with them, because you start to switch on more nerves and the nerves start to learn what's going on. So as you can see, we've got strength, we've got hypertrophy, and we've got the neural adaptation coming around here. But wanted to take away really what kind of progress we can make, and definitely in terms of strength, that's going to happen very, very quickly. So we should now understand the stretch reflex. We should understand reciprocal inhibition and how it helps our muscles to work as pairs. We should know some of the neuromuscular adaptations associated with training, as we've just looked at on the diagram there. And we should be able to explain the benefits of improved neuromuscular coordination / efficiency on exercise performance. And that's really on the last slide that I picked up on. We can start to move more stuff, we can start to get stronger, we can start to move more quickly, because we can use our nervous system more effectively. I hope that one's helped, and see you at the next video, where we're going to talk about something called the endocrine system, or our hormones. So I'll see you there.